close your eyes. There is a man standing at a crossroads. It is 4,000 years ago. Behind him, the sea is catching the last light of the afternoon, blue and restless, carrying the smell of salt and cedar and places he has never seen but has heard about from men who came through here last season with their donkeys loaded heavy and their eyes full of distance. Ahead of him, the land opens into a flat plain that goes east until the sky swallows it. To his south, a road disappears into sand and heat toward a river country his grandfather described as the place where the world began. To his north, mountains rise dark against the cooling sky, their highest ridges still holding snow that will not melt until summer is almost gone. He is not a king. He is not a general. He is a merchant of moderate means and considerable experience. And he has been walking for 11 days. His 2 donkeys carry bolts of Egyptian linen. A dozen copper ingots from the island men call alashia, and 1 small sealed jar of purple dye that is worth more than everything else he owns combined. He does not think of himself as standing at the center of the world, but he is. Every great empire of the ancient world eventually turned its attention to this land. Egypt came, Assyria came, Babylon came, Persia came, Greece came, Rome came. Tonight, we ask why. Settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade. The merchant is still standing at his crossroads, reading the light, deciding which way to go. We begin where the story demands we begin, in a place that had no choice but to matter. Chapter 1. The Crossroads. Why this land? Start with a question that sounds almost too simple to be worth asking seriously. Why here? The ancient world was not empty, and it was not waiting to be civilized. Egypt had already built structures that would outlast every empire that came after it. Mesopotamia had invented writing, law, and the first cities large enough to require both. The Aegean was producing sailors who thought nothing of crossing open water in wooden boats held together by rope and experience. Human beings were solving the fundamental problems of survival and social complexity on every inhabited continent, in forests and river deltas and mountain valleys spread across the known world. So why did every great power of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world eventually turn its attention to this particular strip of land along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea? Why did armies march through here again and again, century after century, from every direction? Why did the people who lived here develop the alphabet that you are processing right now? The trade networks that first connected the ancient world into something resembling a single economy, and the religious traditions that still shape the daily lives of billions of people today? The answer is not that this land was especially gentle or especially rich. It was neither. The answer is geography. And to understand the geography, you have to look at a map and then think carefully about what maps actually mean in human terms. Picture the eastern Mediterranean coast, a narrow ribbon of land running roughly north to south, pressed between the sea on the west and the desert on the east. In places, it is perhaps 60 miles wide. In others, it narrows to almost nothing before opening again. In the north, the land rises into mountain ranges that ancient peoples knew as the home of the cedar tree, the most valuable structural timber in a world that built its warships and its palace roofs and its temple beams from wood. In the south, the ribbon narrows further before opening into the dry flatlands of the Sinai, the land bridge connecting Africa to Asia. This is the Levant, and its significance is not what it contains. Its significance is where it sits. It is the only practical land corridor between Africa and Eurasia. Every army that needed to move between Egypt and Mesopotamia had to pass through it. Every merchant moving goods between the Mediterranean world and the inland empires of the East had to move through it. Every idea, every technology, every innovation that traveled between the ancient civilizations of Africa and Asia passed through this narrow strip of coast. For thousands of years, the Levant was not simply a place. It was a mechanism. It was the hinge on which the ancient world turned. Now add the resources. The cedar forests of Lebanon were not a minor geographical detail. They were a strategic asset of the first order in a world where timber was the steel of its age. Egypt had almost none worth speaking of. Mesopotamia had almost none either. The great river valleys that produced the grain surpluses feeding the first cities had no trees large enough to roof a significant building or build a seaworthy vessel. The cedar of the Lebanese mountains was the solution to a problem that every ancient civilization with serious ambitions eventually faced. When the Egyptian pharaoh Sneferu sent ships to the Levantine coast nearly 5,000 years ago to bring back cedar logs for his building projects, he was doing something that rulers would keep doing for the next 3,000 years. He was buying the one thing his civilization could not produce for itself. Then there is the sea. The Mediterranean is not simply a body of water. In the ancient world, it was a highway. And a fast one. A ship sailing west from the Levantine coast could reach Egypt in days, Cyprus in a day or two, and the great ports of the Aegean within a week with favorable winds. The people who controlled the eastern end of that highway controlled access to everything it connected. The Phoenician port cities that rose on the Lebanese coast did not become the greatest maritime traders of the ancient world because their sailors were uniquely brave by temperament. They became what they became because their geography gave them harbours on the Mediterranean and forests of cedar on the hillside directly behind those harbours. And they were clear-eyed enough to understand what that combination was worth. But the land also lacked things, and the absences matter as much as the presence. The Levant had no great river system of its own. The Jordan River, running south through the inland valley, is a modest waterway by any standard of comparison. It cannot support the kind of large-scale irrigation agriculture that produced the massive grain surpluses of the Nile Valley or the Tigris-Euphrates plain. The land is fertile in places, particularly in the coastal valleys and the river basins of inland Syria. But it cannot independently feed the population density that generates great empires on its own terms. What this meant in practice is that the Levant could never be entirely self-sufficient. It needed the grain of Egypt or the agricultural wealth of the Mesopotamian heartland to sustain a large urban population, and to obtain what it needed, it had to trade, and to trade successfully over long distances and across cultural boundaries, it had to develop the skills, the institutions, and the human networks that durable trade requires. The poverty of the land in certain resources was not a constraint on its importance. It was one of the engines of its importance. Necessity built the mechanisms that made the Levant indispensable to the world around it. Now consider the human geography layered on top of all of this. Because the Levant sat at the intersection of so many different routes and so many different civilizations, it was never ethnically or culturally uniform. From the earliest periods of recorded history, the region was home to a remarkable diversity of peoples, languages, and ways of life existing in close proximity and constant interaction. Farmers in the coastal valleys, pastoralists on the inland steppes, merchants in the harbour cities, nomads moving through the desert margins with their flocks and their knowledge of the roads. These were not separate worlds, sealed off from each other. They were in constant contact, constant competition, and constant exchange. That diversity generated something that more isolated environments could not produce at the same rate. It generated the collision of ideas. When a Mesopotamian merchant sat down to negotiate with an Egyptian official in a Canaanite port city, mediated by a local translator who spoke 3 languages and worshipped gods that neither of the others recognized, Something was happening that would have consequences far beyond the transaction being conducted. Ideas were moving, practices were being observed and adapted. Technologies were crossing cultural boundaries in both directions simultaneously. The historian Fernand Braudel wrote about the Mediterranean as a world shaped more by the sea it surrounded than by the individual cultures living on its shores. The Levant was the eastern anchor of that world, the place where the sea routes met the land routes that went deeper into the ancient interior than any ship could follow. There is a phrase scholars use for this region, the land bridge. It is accurate as far as it goes, but a bridge implies something passive, something that simply connects two points without shaping what crosses it. The Levant was never passive. Every army that marched through it was changed by the experience. Every merchant who traded there came away with more than goods. Every empire that tried to hold it discovered that holding it was a fundamentally different kind of problem than holding anywhere else. Because the people of the Levant had been navigating the pressures of the Crossroads for longer than most civilizations had existed, they had developed, generation by generation, a particular set of capacities. The capacity to negotiate between powers larger than themselves, the capacity to find value in exchange rather than conquest, the capacity to absorb influence from multiple directions without being entirely absorbed by any one of them. These were not natural gifts or ethnic characteristics. They were skills, developed under sustained pressure, the way all the most important human skills always are. Geography did not make the Levant significant by accident. It made it necessary, and then it made it difficult, and then it forced the people who chose to stay there to become precisely the kind of people that a crossroads requires. That is where everything else begins. The merchant, at his crossroads, picks up his reins. His donkeys are patient animals, accustomed to uncertainty. The road going east is longer, but the prices at the end of it are better. The road going south is safer, but the customs officials at the border are thorough and expensive. He has been making this calculation his whole life. His father made it before him. His son will make it after him. He turns east. The plain opens in front of him like a door. Everything that follows begins with that choice. Chapter 2. The First Cities, Ebla, and the World Before Empires. 17,000. Take a moment with that number before moving past it. 17,000 clay tablets, discovered in the royal archive of a city that most people alive today have never heard of. 17,000 individual documents recording the transactions and treaties and hymns and trade agreements of a civilization that was already old when the Great Pyramids of Giza were being planned. The city was called Ebla. It sat on a low hill in what is now northwestern Syria, roughly 35 miles south of the modern city of Aleppo. When Italian archaeologists began excavating it in the 1960s and 1970s, what they found beneath the earth rewrote what scholars thought they understood about the ancient Near East. Most people who think about the ancient world carry a story in their heads, a story of a few great centers of power and complexity, Egypt and Mesopotamia above all, surrounded by a periphery of simpler peoples who were eventually transformed by contact with those great civilizations. It is a tidy story. It is also, as Ebla demonstrates with considerable force, incomplete. By around 2400 BCE, Ebla was one of the largest cities in the ancient Near East. Scholarly estimates of its population range from 30,000 to 50,000 people, with the genuine uncertainty those estimates carry, given the difficulty of reconstructing ancient urban populations from physical evidence alone. But whatever the precise number, the order of magnitude is not in dispute. This was not a village on the margins of someone else's civilization. It was a major urban center in its own right, with its own palace complex, its own temples, its own system of governance. and its own archive of written records documenting, in considerable detail, the sophistication of the world it inhabited. The archive is where the real story lives. Among the tablets found at Ebla, scholars discovered documents written in two languages. One was Sumerian, already functioning in this period as something like an international language of administration and commerce, much as Latin did in medieval Europe or English does today. The other was a previously unknown Semitic language that scholars named Eblate, now understood as a very early member of the Northwest Semitic language family, a family related to the wider group that would later include Phoenician, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic. Take a moment with that as well. The language spoken in the palace and markets of Ebla 4,500 years ago belongs to the same broad linguistic family as the languages in which the Hebrew Bible was written, in which the New Testament was composed, in which the Quran was revealed. The people pressing styluses into wet clay in that archive room were not on the margins of history. They were speaking an early form of a linguistic tradition whose later descendants would carry the most widely followed religious ideas in human experience. They did not know this. They were recording grain allocations and diplomatic correspondence and contracts for the movement of textiles. They were doing the ordinary work of running a complex city in a demanding world. But the language they used to do that work was already part of something larger than any of them could see. What the tablets reveal about Ebla is not a city isolated in the Syrian hills. They reveal a city embedded in a web of relationships stretching across an enormous geographic area. The archive records diplomatic contact and trade with communities across Syria and Mesopotamia, along the Mediterranean coast, into Anatolia and Canaan. There are records of textile production on a scale that implies sophisticated manufacturing, not household craft. There are records of metal trade and timber trade and agricultural exchange across distances that required organizational capacity of a high order. The political structure the tablets reveal is particularly interesting. Ebla was not governed by a single hereditary monarch in the manner of later Near Eastern kingdoms. The evidence points toward a more complex arrangement, one in which power was shared between a king and a council of elders drawn from the city's leading merchant families. The king's term appears to have been limited rather than permanent. Real authority was distributed in ways that scholars sometimes compare, with appropriate caution about such comparisons, to the merchant oligarchies that would appear much later in the Phoenician cities and in medieval Venice. This was not an accident of political evolution. It was the institutional expression of a commercial economy, a system designed to protect the interests of the merchant class that was the foundation of the city's wealth and the source of its reach. The wealth came primarily from textiles. Ebla was a center of cloth production on a scale that still impresses scholars working through the production records. Tens of thousands of garments moved through the city's economy in single accounting periods. Wool came in from the pastoral communities of the Syrian steppe. Skilled weavers in palace workshops transformed it into finished cloth. Merchants carried it to markets across the ancient world and brought back metals, luxury goods, and raw materials that kept the system running. This was an integrated commercial economy, not a subsistence community that happened to have a palace. Then, sometime around 2300 BCE, Ebla was destroyed. The physical evidence of destruction is clear in the archaeological record. The palace burned. The fire that consumed the building baked the archive tablets hard enough to preserve them through 40 centuries of burial, a pattern familiar to anyone who has followed the story of other ancient archives. The specific agent of destruction remains debated among scholars. Ancient tradition points towards Sargon of Akkad or his grandson Naram-Sin. And while the evidence for either attribution is complex and not fully resolved, What lies beyond dispute is that one of the great commercial cities of the ancient Near East was burned to the ground. But Ebla was rebuilt. This detail matters as much as the destruction itself. The people who survived rebuilt their city on the same hill, following roughly the same layout, maintaining the same commercial and administrative traditions that had made the first Ebla significant. The second Ebla continued to function as a meaningful urban center for another 1,000 years. It was not the same city. The archive was not replaced on the same scale. The political arrangements shifted with the changed circumstances of the post-Akkadian world. But the basic persistence of Ebla as a place where people organized complex lives together continued through the catastrophe that ended its first great period. This pattern, the destruction and rebuilding of the same settlements across long stretches of time, is one of the defining features of Levantine history. The land was too important, too positioned, too necessary to the networks that moved through it to be permanently abandoned. Every time a city was burned, someone rebuilt it, because the geography that made it valuable had not changed. The hill that gave Ebla its position still gave it that position after the fire. The trade routes that passed near it still passed near it. Geography is patient in a way that empires are not. What Ebla tells us, beyond the specifics of its economy and its politics, is something more fundamental about the world of the ancient Levant. It tells us that complexity was not invented in one place and then exported outward to the rest of the world. The ancient Near East was full of centers of sophisticated urban life that developed in parallel, in contact with each other, borrowing and competing, and sometimes destroying each other. But none of them simply derivative of a single original source. The story of the ancient world is not one light illuminating surrounding darkness. It is many fires burning simultaneously across a wide landscape, each shaped by its own local conditions and its own particular genius. All of them in constant interaction with the others. Ebla was one of those fires. It burned for a long time. It left traces in the earth that we are still reading. And the language spoken by the people who built it belongs to a family that is still spoken today, by hundreds of millions of people who have never heard of Tel Marduk, which is what the site of ancient Ebla is called on modern maps. The excavations continue in seasons when conditions in the region allow. New tablets emerge occasionally. New details of a world that most people have never encountered continue to surface from the earth. The merchants who traded in Ebla's markets are long gone, but their records remain, pressed into clay that proved harder than the palace walls that once surrounded it, harder than the political arrangements that organized it, harder than the empire that burned it. Some things outlast the people who built them by longer than anyone building them ever imagined. Chapter 3. Egypt's Shadow, the New Kingdom, and the Levant. In the spring of 1457 BCE, an Egyptian army was moving through a narrow mountain pass in the hills of Canaan before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridges. The route was called the Aruna Road, and in places soldiers had to walk in single file, their equipment scraping the rock walls on either side. Every senior officer on the commanding general's staff had advised against this route. The broader northern and southern approaches were safer, more predictable, less likely to produce the kind of catastrophe that narrow defiles invite. They had made their case clearly and professionally. The commanding general listened to all of them, too. Then he ordered the march through the pass anyway. His name was Thutmose the Third, Pharaoh of Egypt. The city, waiting on the other side of the pass, was called Megiddo, and the gamble he made that morning, moving fast through dangerous ground to arrive before the enemy expected him, is preserved in what scholars consider among the earliest surviving detailed tactical accounts of a military campaign. The account was carved into the walls of the temple of Amun at Karnak by Thutmose's own scribes. Royal inscriptions are not journalism. They are arguments, made in stone, for the greatness of the person who commissioned them. But the operational detail, in the Megiddo record, the routes considered, the objections raised, the timing of the assault, is specific enough that military historians have studied it seriously as a tactical document, rather than simply as ceremonial propaganda. The coalition of Canaanite and Syrian rulers, waiting at Megiddo, had positioned their forces along the safer routes. When Thutmose's army emerged from the pass, formed its battle lines, and struck before the coalition could fully respond, the result was a rout that broke the organized resistance of the Levantine city-states in a single morning. The reason Thutmose the Third was at Megiddo at all tells you something essential about the relationship between Egypt and the Levant that would define the region for centuries. Egypt needed the Levant, the way a great power needs a combination of buffer zone, resource supply, and demonstration of reach, all at the same time. The cedar forests of Lebanon were not optional for a civilization that built its warships and palace roofs from timber. The trade routes running through the Levantine coast connected Egypt to the copper of Cyprus, the tin of Anatolia, and the luxury goods of the wider ancient world. Control of the Levant meant control of Egypt's supply lines. Loss of the Levant meant vulnerability in every direction. The New Kingdom pharaohs understood this with a clarity that the experience of the Hyksos period had made visceral rather than merely theoretical. The Hyksos, a people of Canaanite and Levantine background who had established themselves in the Nile Delta during a period of Egyptian weakness, had ruled parts of Egypt for roughly a century before being expelled by the founders of the New Kingdom around 1550 BCE. Being ruled by outsiders from the northeast had taught the Egyptians something that no amount of strategic theory could teach as effectively. The land to their northeast was not simply a neighbor, it was the direction from which their gravest threats could come. The only reliable answer was to project Egyptian power into the Levant before the Levant could project itself into Egypt. Thutmose the Third spent 17 campaigns over 20 years systematically building Egyptian dominance over the Levantine city-states. Megiddo was the first, and in many ways the most important, because it broke the coordinated resistance that the Canaanite and Syrian rulers had organized. After Megiddo fell, city after city in the region accepted Egyptian authority, not always willingly and not always permanently, but with a recognition that the balance of power had shifted in a way they could not immediately reverse. What the Egyptians built in the Levant was not, by the standards of later empires, a simple occupation. It was something more subtle and in some ways more revealing about how imperial power actually works when it is functioning well. The system they developed was a form of indirect rule. The local rulers of Canaanite and Syrian city-states were generally left in place. Their cities were not garrisoned with permanent Egyptian troops in most cases. They were not required to adopt Egyptian religion or Egyptian administrative practices in their internal affairs. What they were required to do was send tribute, and they were required to send their sons. This second requirement is worth sitting with, because it reveals the sophistication of the Egyptian approach to maintaining long-term loyalty in a region they could not permanently occupy in force. The sons of Canaanite rulers were brought to the Egyptian court as children and educated there. They learned to speak and read Egyptian. They absorbed Egyptian culture and Egyptian ways of thinking about power and legitimacy. And then, when their fathers died, they were sent back to rule their home cities as loyal clients, not only because they feared Egyptian military power, though they feared it, but because they had genuinely internalized a worldview in which Egypt was the natural center of civilization and the pharaoh was the natural apex of the political order. It was, as a mechanism of imperial control, extraordinarily cost-effective. The loyalty it produced was more durable than the loyalty produced by fear alone. The archive of clay tablets found at Tel El Amarna in Egypt in 1887 CE gives us a window into how this system felt from inside it. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian court during the reigns of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, include letters from the rulers of Canaanite and Syrian city-states written in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the period. They address the pharaoh with elaborate formulas of submission. They call themselves the dirt beneath his feet. They express their absolute devotion to his person and their complete dependence on his protection. And then, in the body of the letter, they very carefully tell him what they need. One of the most striking voices in the archive belongs to a governor named Abdi Heba, who administered a city called Urusalim, which scholars identify with Jerusalem. His letters to the pharaoh are urgent, almost desperate. He reports that neighboring rulers are conspiring against him, that a group called the Hapiru are raiding the territory under his control, that he does not have enough Egyptian support to stop them, that if the pharaoh does not act, the lands of the pharaoh in this region will be lost. The identity of the Hapiru mentioned across the Amarna archive is one of the more carefully debated questions in the scholarship of this period. Some earlier scholars suggested a direct connection to the Hebrew people of the biblical tradition. Most contemporary scholars are more cautious, understanding Hapiru as a social category, possibly describing landless or stateless people existing outside the normal structures of settled society, rather than a specific ethnic group. The relationship between the Hapiru of these tablets and the later Israelite tradition is a question that requires significant scholarly qualification to address responsibly, and one that the field continues to discuss with genuine care. What the letters reveal, beyond the specific situations they describe, is the lived texture of the Egyptian imperial relationship. It was not a relationship between a great power and passive subjects. It was a continuous negotiation, conducted across vast distances by people with real interests and real agency. Abdi Heba of Jerusalem was not simply a subordinate writing to his master. He was a political operator, working a system he understood well, trying to extract what his city needed from a relationship he could not exit but could sometimes influence. The Egyptian system in the Levant worked reasonably well for roughly 3 centuries, but it contained the structural weakness that every system built on indirect rule eventually confronts. The loyalty of client rulers is conditional. It depends on the continued ability and willingness of the imperial power to enforce the relationship. When that ability falters, clients recalculate. By the 13th century BCE, Egypt was under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The Hittite Empire had pushed deep into Syria, directly challenging Egyptian dominance in the northern Levant. The two great powers fought the most famous chariot engagement of the ancient world at Kadesh, in what is now western Syria. Around 1274 BCE, the battle was militarily inconclusive, though both sides claimed victory in terms their respective traditions found satisfying. The treaty that followed is significant in its own right, as one of the earliest surviving international peace treaties in the historical record. And the fact that both the Egyptian and the Hittite versions survive allows scholars to compare how each power presented the same agreement, which is itself illuminating about how diplomacy actually works between powers that need each other. The Kadesh Treaty established a line acknowledging Egyptian primacy in the south and Hittite primacy in the north. It was a recognition that neither power was strong enough to control the entire region alone. It was also, in retrospect, a document signed on the edge of a catastrophe that neither side could see coming. Within half a century of the Kadesh Treaty, the world that had produced it would be gone. The Levant, under Egyptian influence, had absorbed that influence in the way it had always absorbed the influence of great powers. thoroughly enough to maintain the relationships that were keeping it safe, selectively enough to remain beneath the Egyptian surface, recognizably itself. The cities of Canaan continued to speak their own languages and worship their own gods. The merchants of the Levantine coast continued to build their networks in directions that Egyptian power could not entirely control. That capacity for absorption without dissolution was not a passive quality, it was a skill, developed under sustained pressure, by people who had learned that survival in a crossroads world required knowing how to take what was useful from the powers surrounding you without becoming entirely what those powers wanted you to be. The shadow stretches long across the Levantine hills. But shadows move when the light changes. And the light was about to change in a way that no one inside the system could see coming. Chapter 4. The Bronze Age Collapse, when everything ended. There is a letter that was never delivered. It was written on a clay tablet sometime around 1200 BCE, in the city of Ugarit, one of the great port cities of the ancient Levantine coast. The man who wrote it was the king of Ugarit, and he was writing to the king of Al-Ashir, which scholars identify with Cyprus. The letter describes ships appearing off the coast. Many ships. The writer does not know where they came from. He knows only that they have already struck once, that his own fleet is gone, sent away to support operations elsewhere, and that his army is in the north, fighting a different enemy. He asks for help. He says the situation is very bad. The tablet was found in a kiln. It had been prepared for firing, which means it was meant to be sent. It was never sent. Before it could leave the city, Ugarit was destroyed. The fire that consumed the city baked the tablet hard enough to survive. The message reached its destination roughly 3,000 years late, in the hands of a French archaeologist working at the site in the 20th century CE. Ugarit was never rebuilt. What happened around 1200 BCE across the eastern Mediterranean is one of the most actively debated questions in ancient history. And the debate is worth taking seriously not just as an academic puzzle, but as a story about what civilizations actually are and how they actually end. Because what ended around 1200 BCE was not one civilization, it was a system. And understanding the difference between those two things is the key to understanding why the collapse was so total and so swift. The world of the late Bronze Age, Eastern Mediterranean, was, by the standards of its time, a remarkably integrated international system. Egypt was at the height of its new kingdom power. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia and much of northern Syria. The palace civilizations of Mycenaean Greece were producing art and trade goods of extraordinary quality. The city-states of Cyprus were processing copper ore into the ingots that supplied metalworkers across the region. And the great port cities of the Levant, Ugarit, above all others, sat at the center of a web of commercial relationships, connecting all of these powers into something that functioned, in economic terms, almost like a single market. Scholars, including Eric Klein, whose work on the Bronze Age collapse has shaped much of the current scholarly conversation, have argued that this integration was both the system's greatest achievement and its fundamental vulnerability. The interconnection that made the system so productive also made it fragile in a specific way. When one part of the system failed, the failure did not stay contained. It propagated through the connections that had made the system work, amplifying and accelerating until what began as a local crisis became a regional catastrophe. The specific causes of the collapse remain genuinely contested, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that no single explanation has achieved consensus among scholars working with the available evidence. What the evidence points toward is a convergence of stresses arriving at roughly the same time from multiple directions. Climate data, derived from tree rings, pollen records, and sediment cores taken from sites across the eastern Mediterranean, suggests that the region experienced a prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BCE and continuing for several decades. Ancient texts from multiple sites describe famines and food shortages in terms specific enough to suggest that agricultural production had genuinely failed over a wide area. A letter from the Hittite king to the pharaoh requesting grain with considerable urgency makes clear that the situation in Anatolia was desperate. The Hittite king was not a man who asked for help easily or without cause. Drought alone, however, does not explain a collapse of this magnitude. What the drought did, if the climate evidence is interpreted correctly, was weaken the palace economies that held the system together at precisely the moment when other stresses were simultaneously building. The palace economies of the Bronze Age were redistributive systems in which the palace collected agricultural surplus and redistributed it to support specialized craftspeople, soldiers, administrators, and religious personnel. This system worked well when surplus was plentiful. When drought reduced the surplus, the palace had less to redistribute, which meant that the people whose livelihoods depended on palace redistribution had less to live on, which meant they had progressively less reason to remain loyal to an institution that was failing them. The Mycenaean palaces show evidence of increased fortification in the decades before their destruction, which suggests that the people inside them were aware of internal threats as well as external ones. The Linear B tablets from Pylos, written in what appear to be the last days before that palace burned, include records of coastal watchers being posted, rowers being mobilized, and offerings being made to the gods in what reads, "From this distance," like a community doing everything it can think of to prevent something it can already sense approaching. And then there were the people the ancient Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples. This is where the story becomes genuinely complicated in ways that reward careful attention. The Sea Peoples appear primarily in Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses the Third, who fought two major engagements against groups moving through the eastern Mediterranean in the early 12th century BCE. The reliefs and inscriptions at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu name several distinct groups and describe them in terms that have given scholars much to analyze and much to dispute. The Peliset among them are widely but not universally identified with the Philistines who appear in the Hebrew Bible. The identification of the other named groups is more contested and remains an open question in the field. Who the Sea Peoples were, where exactly they came from, and what role they played in the collapse is one of the most actively debated questions in Bronze Age scholarship. Earlier generations of scholars tended to present them as the primary cause of the collapse. A great wave of migrants sweeping in and destroying the palace civilizations in their path. More recent scholarship, including the work of Klein and others, has pushed back on this interpretation, arguing that the Sea Peoples were more likely a symptom of the collapse than its primary cause. Groups displaced by the same combination of stresses affecting everyone else, moving through a world that was already failing rather than causing it to fail. The truth is probably more complex than either version, and probably different in different places. What is not in dispute is what the archaeological record shows. Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was destroyed and never rebuilt. The Mycenaean palace centers burned. The palace economy of Cyprus collapsed. The trade networks that had connected these centers dissolved. The volume of goods moving across the eastern Mediterranean dropped catastrophically and did not recover for centuries. The specific texture of what this meant for individual people is harder to recover than the macro-level picture, but the evidence from individual sites gives some sense of it. At Ugarit, the final layer before destruction contains hordes of valuables buried under floors, the ancient equivalent of hiding your savings before you flee. It contains unfinished metalwork in workshops, tools laid down in the middle of jobs that were never completed. It contains the archive of tablets, including the king's unsent letter to Cyprus, asking for help that did not come in time. These are not the traces of a city that had time to prepare for its end. They are the traces of a city that ended in the middle of ordinary life. The scribes who maintained the writing traditions at Ugarit did not carry their knowledge to a new location. It died with the city. The specific alphabetic system they had developed was lost. The knowledge accumulated in the palace archive was buried under rubble that would not be excavated for 3,000 years. What came after the collapse was not nothing. People survived. Communities persisted. The pastoral peoples of the inland regions, more mobile and less dependent on the palace economy, continued to move and trade and maintain their lives. The Egyptian state survived in a reduced form. Some Levantine cities were rebuilt on the ruins of their predecessors, by people learning to live in a world whose complexity had been drastically reduced. But it was a different world. The palace economies did not return. The long-distance trade networks did not reassemble on the same scale for centuries. Dark ages are not simply periods of loss. They are periods of clearing and reorganization, in which the structures that failed make space for the people who survived to begin, slowly and without knowing what they are building, to construct the arrangements that will become the next era's version of civilization. In the Levant, the centuries after 1200 BCE saw the emergence of new political and cultural configurations in the space left by the collapse of the Bronze Age powers. The Egyptian Empire in Canaan contracted and eventually disappeared. The Hittite Empire did not recover. In the space that opened as these great powers receded, the smaller peoples of the Levantine coast, who had always been there, but always in the shadow of larger powers, began to develop in directions that the constraints of the Bronze Age system had not permitted. Among those peoples were the inhabitants of a string of port cities along the Lebanese coast, cities called Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, cities that had been commercial ports under Egyptian and Hittite influence for centuries, cities that now, in the changed world of the early Iron Age, found themselves in a position they had never occupied before. They were free, not because anyone had given them freedom, because the powers that had constrained them had collapsed, and they were about to do something with that freedom that would change the world more thoroughly than any of those collapsed empires ever managed to do. They were going to sail west. Chapter 5. The Phoenicians merchants who gave the world its alphabet. Consider what it actually means to give the world its alphabet. Not to invent writing. Writing was already ancient when the Phoenicians rose to prominence. The Sumerians had been pressing marks into clay for 2,000 years. The Egyptians had developed hieroglyphics of extraordinary complexity. The scribes of Ugarit had created an early alphabetic system before the Bronze Age collapse destroyed their city. The idea of using marks on a surface to represent language was not new. What the Phoenicians did was something more specific and ultimately more consequential. They developed, refined, and above all spread a writing system built on a principle so elegant that it looks, in retrospect, almost inevitable. One mark for one consonant sound. 22 characters. Any word in any language using similar sounds could be represented by combining them. This system is the traceable ancestor of the Greek alphabet. The Greek alphabet is the traceable ancestor of the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet, in various modified forms, is the writing system you are using right now to process these words. The chain of transmission is documented and not seriously disputed. When Greek traders came into contact with Phoenician merchants sometime in the 9th or 8th century BCE, they adopted the Phoenician letter forms and added characters to represent vowel sounds that the Phoenician system left to context. The Greeks passed their adapted version to the Romans. The Romans spread it across Europe. it has been spreading ever since. Every word, written in a Latin alphabet language, is the living, downstream consequence of decisions made by merchants in Lebanese port cities roughly 3,000 years ago about the most efficient way to keep track of their shipments. The Phoenicians gave the world its alphabet, not because they were the first to think about alphabetic writing, but because they were the people who spread it. And they spread it because of who they were and what they did. They were merchants. This is the fact from which everything else follows. The Phoenician cities, primarily Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, along with a number of smaller ports along the Lebanese coast, were not the centers of great land empires. They did not command vast agricultural territories or large conscript armies. They sat on a narrow coastal plain pressed between the Mediterranean and the Lebanon mountains, with excellent natural harbors and extraordinary cedar forests on the hillsides directly behind those harbors, and not much else in the way of resources. The Bronze Age palace economies that had organized the region were gone. The Egyptian Empire in the Levant had contracted. The Hittites were gone. The world that had constrained the Levantine coast cities to the role of useful subordinates had collapsed. What remained was the geography. The harbors were still there. The cedar was still there. The accumulated knowledge of the sea routes that Levantine sailors had been traveling for centuries was still there, held in the memories of people whose families had worked those routes for generations. And the demand for goods that made those routes worth sailing still existed. In the communities that had survived the collapse and were slowly rebuilding their capacity to participate in long-distance exchange, the Phoenicians stepped into the space the collapse had created and built something that the Bronze Age system, for all its sophistication, had never produced. A commercial network that was genuinely independent of any imperial power, one that operated on the logic of trade rather than tribute, and that extended further across the Mediterranean than anything that had come before it. The purple dye produced along the Phoenician coast deserves particular attention because it tells you something important about how the Phoenicians built their commercial advantage. Tyrian purple, extracted from the murex sea snail in a process that was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and by ancient accounts extremely unpleasant in terms of the smells involved, produced a color of extraordinary quality. A deep, rich purple that did not fade in sunlight or repeated washing, that actually intensified with age rather than diminishing. In a world before synthetic dyes, this permanence made it almost uniquely valuable. The quantities of snails required to produce even small amounts of finished dye were enormous, which meant that the price of the finished product reflected the genuine scarcity of the labor and materials required to produce it. Purple became the color of royalty and extreme wealth across the ancient world, not because someone decided it should be, but because it was the color that only the extremely wealthy could afford. The Phoenicians did not create this demand. They supplied it, at enormous profit, for centuries. When later Roman law restricted certain shades of purple to the emperor, it was codifying in law what had been economic reality since before Rome existed. But the most consequential Phoenician export was not dye or timber or glass. It was the city itself. Beginning in the 9th century BCE and accelerating through the 8th and 7th, the Phoenician cities, led above all by Tyre, established a network of colonies and trading posts across the Western Mediterranean that represents one of the most ambitious acts of commercial expansion in the ancient world. The Phoenicians were not sending surplus population to establish agricultural settlements in new territories. They were establishing commercial outposts, places where Phoenician merchants could resupply, maintain relations with local communities, and keep the network of exchange functioning across distances that no single voyage could cover. The most important of these foundations was Carthage, established by settlers from Tyre on the North African coast in what is now Tunisia. Ancient tradition places its founding around 814 BCE, though scholars approach the precise date with appropriate caution given the nature of the sources. Carthage grew from a trading post to a city-state to an empire of its own, eventually controlling western Mediterranean trade routes and coming into direct conflict with Rome in a series of wars that reshaped the ancient world. What matters here is the principle the Phoenician colonial network embodied. Trade follows the network, not the flag. The Phoenicians did not need to conquer the peoples they traded with. They needed access to their markets and their raw materials. The relationship they sought was commercial, not political. They were willing to adapt their practices to local conditions, to build temples alongside local religious sites, to learn local languages, to intermarry with local populations. As long as the exchange continued to flow in both directions, this approach had real limitations. It produced influence rather than control, and influence cannot be enforced the way military dominance can. When a local power decided that the terms of trade were no longer acceptable, the Phoenicians had fewer options than an empire with legions available. But it also produced something that military empires consistently struggled to achieve: a network that was genuinely valued by the people who participated in it, because their participation was voluntary and the benefits were real and immediate. The alphabet moved through this network, the way goods moved through it. Greek traders who interacted with Phoenician merchants encountered the writing system the Phoenicians used to maintain their commercial records. They recognized its utility. They adapted it to their own language, adding the vowel markers that the Phoenician consonantal system left to be inferred from context. In doing so, they created a tool that would eventually enable the literature and philosophy and scientific writing of the classical Greek world. The Phoenicians themselves left relatively little in the way of literature that has survived. This is partly a matter of materials. Papyrus and other organic writing surfaces do not survive as well as baked clay under most burial conditions. It is also partly a matter of what later powers did to Phoenician cities. Carthage was destroyed so thoroughly by Rome in 146 BCE that the destruction became a point of historical reference. Tyre was besieged and largely destroyed by Alexander the Great after a 7-month campaign. The physical record of Phoenician civilization is thinner than the record of cultures that were less commercially successful, but more archaeologically preserved. What remains are the traces they left in other people's records and other people's material culture. Phoenician objects found across an enormous geographic range. References to Phoenician merchants and craftsmen in Egyptian, Assyrian, and Greek texts. The remains of their colonial foundations in North Africa and Spain, where archaeological work continues to recover details of their presence. And the alphabet, which is the most durable thing they ever made, precisely because it was not made from stone or cedar or purple cloth. It was made from an idea simple enough to be learnt in weeks and powerful enough to represent any human language. The Assyrian Empire, expanding westward in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, eventually brought the Phoenician cities under its authority. The Phoenicians paid tribute and continued trading, adapting to the new political reality with the pragmatism that had always characterized their approach to power relationships. Tyre, in particular, maintained a degree of commercial independence, even under Assyrian dominance, that reflects how clearly the Assyrians understood the value of the commercial network the Tyrians operated. An empire that destroyed Tyre destroyed its own revenue stream. That calculation kept the city alive in ways that purely military logic might not have. The Phoenicians made themselves indispensable, not through military strength, which they never possessed in quantity, and not through political unity, which they never achieved among their competing city-states. They made themselves indispensable through the network itself, through the accumulated knowledge and relationships and trust that centuries of commercial activity had built across the Mediterranean world. When that network eventually collapsed under the pressure of successive empires, the alphabet did not collapse with it. The alphabet had already escaped. It was already being used by peoples across the Mediterranean to write languages that the original Phoenician merchants had never spoken, carrying not just commercial records, but poetry and history, and eventually the texts of religious traditions that would shape the next 2,000 years of human experience. The Phoenicians are largely invisible in the popular imagination of the ancient world. They did not build the Parthenon. They did not produce the Iliad. What they produced instead was the tool that made it possible for everyone else to produce the things that survived. That is a particular kind of greatness. Quiet, distributed, unstoppable. A, B, C, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, the ox, the house, the camel, still working, still spreading, 3,000 years and counting. Chapter 6. Aram and Israel, small kingdoms in a world of giants. Begin with a man who is not a king. His name does not appear in any royal inscription. He is not commemorated on any victory stele. He lived in the hill country south of Damascus, sometime in the 9th century BCE, in a village of perhaps 300 people, and he owned a small plot of terraced land where he grew barley and kept a few goats and olive trees. He paid taxes to a local lord, who paid taxes to a regional administrator, who paid taxes to a king whose palace he had never seen, and whose name he knew only from the announcements made at the town gate on market days. He was not thinking about empires. He was thinking about the water rights dispute with his neighbor to the east, about whether the barley harvest would cover this year's tax obligations, about which of his two sons was better suited to take over the farm when his knees finally gave out entirely. His elder son had recently announced he wanted to become a merchant instead of a farmer. Having watched a Phoenician trading party pass through the village with their loaded donkeys and their air of purposeful freedom, his father was not sure how to feel about this. Merchants travelled. Merchants came back with strange ideas and stranger friends. Merchants were also, he had to admit, considerably more prosperous than farmers. He was also, without knowing it, living at the intersection of three of the most consequential political forces in the ancient Near East, and the decisions being made in the palaces of Damascus and Samaria and Nineveh, decisions he had no voice in and no knowledge of, would determine whether his village was still standing in 10 years. This is what it meant to be ordinary in the Levant in the 9th century BCE. The kingdoms of Aram, Damascus, and Israel and Judah were not the great powers of the ancient world. They were small states, caught between great powers, doing what small states have always done when caught in that position: maneuvering, calculating, forming coalitions that held until they did not, making alliances with one giant to resist another, knowing that the alliance itself was temporary and the giant was not ultimately trustworthy, surviving, when they managed to survive, not through overwhelming strength, but through a combination of geographic advantage, political skill, and the occasional fortunate miscalculation by an enemy who had too many other problems to finish the job. The Arameans were the first of these smaller Levantine peoples to build a significant political presence in the post-Bronze Age world. They were a Semitic-speaking people who had been present in the Syrian steppe and the upper Euphrates region for centuries, moving with their flocks across the boundaries that settled civilizations drew but could not fully enforce. In the disrupted world of the early Iron Age, when the palace economies were gone and the great empires had not yet reasserted their dominance, the Arameans expanded into the settled regions of Syria with a speed that reflects how thoroughly the collapse had cleared the political landscape. By the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, a series of Aramean city-states had established themselves across Syria. The most important was centered on Damascus. a city set in a fertile oasis east of the anti-Lebanon mountains, watered by the Barada River, positioned on the trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean coast and the routes running north-south between Anatolia and Arabia. It was almost perfectly positioned to function as a commercial and political hub for the inland Levant. The Aramean language that Damascus and the other Aramean states spread through their commercial and diplomatic networks became, over the following centuries, the most widely spoken language across the ancient Near East. This was not because the Arameans built an empire that imposed their language by military force. It was because their commercial networks were extensive enough, and their position at the intersection of so many trade routes was significant enough. The Aramaic became the practical language of business and administration across a wide area. By the time of the Assyrian Empire, Assyrian administrators were using Aramaic alongside their own Akkadian language for correspondence across the empire. By the Persian period, Aramaic was the official administrative language of an empire stretching from Egypt to Central Asia. Most scholars believe it was the primary language spoken in 1st century CE Judea, which means it was almost certainly the daily language of Jesus of Nazareth. The Arameans achieved through commerce and communication an influence that no military campaign could have produced or maintained. South of the Aramean states, in the hill country, running from the Jezreel Valley through the highlands of Canaan, a different political configuration was taking shape. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah, whose histories are preserved in the Hebrew Bible in a form that weaves theological interpretation together with historical memory, are among the most extensively documented small states of the ancient Near East, precisely because the tradition that preserved their memory did so with an intensity that has no parallel in the ancient world. Scholars approach the biblical account of Israelite history with tools that earlier generations did not have. Archaeological work at dozens of sites across the region has accumulated a substantial body of physical evidence that can be compared with the biblical narrative. The relationship between the textual tradition and the archaeological evidence is a subject of extensive and ongoing scholarly discussion, with genuine disagreements among serious researchers working with real evidence. What the combined evidence suggests, with reasonable confidence, is that by the 10th century BCE, a significant political entity existed in the central highlands of Canaan, that by the 9th century it had divided into a northern state called Israel, centered on the city of Samaria, and a southern state called Judah, centered on Jerusalem, and that both states were embedded in the complex web of Levantine politics in ways that shaped their internal development as thoroughly as their religious traditions did. The geopolitical situation that Israel and Judah found themselves in once the Assyrian Empire began its sustained westward expansion is where the problem of smallness becomes not a thought experiment, but a matter of immediate survival. The Assyrian pressure created a situation in which every small state in the region had to make a fundamental strategic choice: submit to Assyrian authority, pay tribute, and accept subordination in exchange for continued existence. Resist, individually or in coalition with other threatened states, accepting the risk that resistance carried, or attempt to play different powers against each other, using Assyrian pressure to extract concessions from Egypt and Egyptian support to resist Assyrian demands, while hoping that the balance of power remained ambiguous enough to make this viable. The historical record shows all three strategies being pursued, sometimes by the same state in different periods, sometimes by different factions within the same state simultaneously. The Assyrian annals record a coalition of Levantine states, including forces from Ahab of Israel, fighting the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. The coalition apparently held the Assyrians off on that occasion, but Assyrian pressure was not something that could be resisted indefinitely by any combination of small Levantine states. Damascus chose resistance more consistently than most and paid for it accordingly. Hazael, one of the most capable Aramean rulers, managed to hold Assyrian pressure at bay for a generation through a combination of military skill and careful diplomacy. His success was real, but it was rented, not owned. It depended on Assyrian weakness in that specific period, not on any structural change in the underlying balance of power. When Tiglath-Pileser III brought the reformed Assyrian military machine to bear on the Levant in the mid-8th century BCE, the space for maneuvering collapsed rapidly. Damascus fell to Assyria in 732 BCE. The kingdom of Aram Damascus, which had been the dominant power of inland Syria for 2 centuries, ceased to exist as an independent state. Israel fell next. The northern kingdom was conquered by Sargon II in 722 BCE. A substantial portion of its population was deported to various parts of the Assyrian Empire. These are the communities that later tradition would remember as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The Israelites dispersed across the Assyrian Empire, who did not return as a cohesive community. Judah made a different calculation. When Israel fell, the kings of Judah adopted a policy of submission to Assyrian authority that was costly and humiliating, but survivable. They paid tribute. They acknowledged Assyrian overlordship. They survived. Back in the village south of Damascus, if the man with the barley field and the water dispute and the 2 sons survived the campaigns at all, he was now living under a different administrative arrangement. The king whose name he heard at the town gate was an Assyrian governor now, or a client of an Assyrian governor. The taxes still came. The water dispute was still unresolved. His elder son had indeed become a merchant, which in the changed world of Assyrian dominance turned out to be a reasonable decision. The Assyrian road network and enforced peace across the region had made certain kinds of commerce safer than it had been in his grandfather's time. The boy was doing well. His father was not sure whether to be proud or simply relieved. The small kingdoms of the Levant were never going to win in a direct military confrontation with Assyria. Their significance in the history of the ancient world does not come from their military power, which was modest, or from their agricultural surplus, which was sufficient but not exceptional. Their significance comes from something harder to quantify and considerably harder to destroy. It comes from the traditions they developed and preserved under the sustained pressure of living in a world of giants. Traditions that turned the specific experience of smallness and vulnerability and survival into a set of ideas about justice and community and the proper relationship between power and responsibility that have shaped human thought for 3,000 years. The prophets whose words are preserved in the Hebrew Bible were not writing theology in any abstract sense. They were responding to specific political situations, specific moments of crisis and decision, with arguments about what justice required and what power was ultimately for. When Amos argued that elaborate ritual observance without genuine social justice was not acceptable, he was making an argument with immediate implications in a society where the wealthy were accumulating land at the expense of small farmers. When Isaiah argued that trust in military alliances was a form of faithlessness, he was making an argument about the limits of political power in a world where political power was demonstrably capable of destroying everything. These arguments were made in a specific historical context by specific people responding to specific pressures, but they were formulated with enough force and enough generality that they have continued to speak to situations their authors could not have imagined, in languages their authors never heard, to people living in worlds their authors could not have conceived. The Assyrian records list Israel among the conquered territories. The biblical tradition turned the conquest into a chapter in a story that is still being read. Which of those 2 things lasted longer is not a question that requires a complicated answer. Chapter 7. The Assyrian Hammer. There is a relief carving in the British Museum in London that stops people. It is not the largest object in the collection. It does not have the monumental scale of some of the palace facade pieces or the visual drama of the great winged bulls that guarded Assyrian palace entrances. But something about it holds visitors in place, in a way that grander objects sometimes fail to do. It shows the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal hunting lions from a chariot, and the lions in the carving are dying in ways that the sculptor has rendered, with an attention to anatomical detail and emotional specificity that is genuinely surprising given the distance of time. One lion rises on its hind legs to attack the chariot, already pierced by arrows, its front legs beginning to fold under it in the specific way that dying animals fold. Another lies on the ground, the life leaving its body in a posture that the sculptor has observed and recorded with a care that seems almost tender. The faces of the lions are not the faces of monsters. They are the faces of animals in extremity, and the sculptor saw them clearly enough to make you feel it. The king in the carving is competent and formal. The lions are unforgettable. There is something in that imbalance. Something in the fact that the artists of the most feared empire of the ancient world rendered the dying of their king's prey with more visible empathy than they rendered the king himself. That tells you something complicated about what Assyrian civilization actually was. Because Assyria was not simply a killing machine, though it was extraordinarily effective at killing. It was a civilization of genuine cultural sophistication that organized its power around the systematic application of terror. And that held both of those things simultaneously, without apparent awareness of any contradiction between them. Understanding how that was possible, and what it produced specifically in the Levant. This is what this chapter is about. The military and administrative reforms that made Assyria the terror of the ancient world accumulated over several reigns in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. Tiglath-Pileser III, who came to power in 745 BCE, reorganized the Assyrian military in ways that addressed the fundamental weakness of earlier Assyrian campaigns. Previous expeditions had been conducted largely with seasonal armies. Troops mobilized for specific campaigns and then returned to their regular lives. Tiglath-Pileser built something closer to a professional standing force, with units that trained continuously and could be sustained on extended campaigns far from the Assyrian heartland. He simultaneously restructured the provincial system. Earlier conquests had often been followed by the installation of local client rulers who remained loyal only as long as Assyrian military presence was immediately available. When the army moved on, clients began calculating their options. Tiglath-Pileser replaced many of these client arrangements with Assyrian governors who reported directly to the king and who were rotated regularly to prevent them from building the local power bases that became the foundation of revolt. The deportation policy that became one of the defining features of Assyrian imperial administration served multiple purposes. But what the historical record rarely conveys in human terms is what this policy actually looked like on the ground in the Levant. Picture a street in Samaria in 722 BCE, the year Sargon II completed the conquest of the northern Israelite kingdom. The scene that follows is illustrative of the kind of administrative work that Assyrian records document from this period. Not a specific recorded event, but a composite of what the evidence tells us these processes looked like. An Assyrian administrator, bearing a name in the pattern typical of officials of the period, sits at a table in what was 3 months ago the courtyard of the city's main administrative building. He has been in the field for 8 months. He is tired. He has before him a list of names, organized by profession, compiled by his staff over the preceding weeks. Scribes, metal workers, carpenters, priests of the major temple, the families of the former military commanders, wealthy merchants, anyone whose knowledge and social connections might make them capable of organizing the kind of sustained resistance that Assyrian governors in other provinces have had to deal with. He is not a cruel man in an personal sense. He has children of his own in Nineveh. He follows his orders because his orders represent the policy of an empire that has calculated correctly that the most effective way to prevent future revolts is to remove the people most capable of leading them. He marks the names. His soldiers will begin the removals tomorrow. The people on that list are going to Mesopotamia, to the agricultural settlements along the irrigation canals, where the Assyrian state needs skilled workers. The people who are not on the list will remain, to be joined eventually by other deported populations from other parts of the empire, creating the mixed community that the Assyrian administrators call pacified, and that the remaining local population experiences as something considerably more complicated. This is how the Assyrian hammer actually worked in the Levant. Not as a single catastrophic blow, but as a systematic reorganization, conducted by ordinary officials following carefully developed procedures, that permanently altered the demographic and cultural landscape of the regions it passed through. The theology that framed this policy is the other essential element for understanding what the Assyrians were doing. The god Ashur had charged the Assyrian king with the mission of extending divine order across the world. Cities that submitted were incorporated into that order. Cities that resisted were, by the internal logic of this theology, in rebellion against divine will, and the violence visited upon them was the necessary correction of a cosmic disorder. The terror was not incidental to the mission. It was part of the mission. A city made an example became a demonstration to every other city that submission was the only rational calculation. This logic, applied consistently over generations, produced effects that the Assyrian kings clearly intended and carefully cultivated. The reputation of Assyrian armies preceded them in ways that sometimes saved the empire and the actual cost of campaigns. Cities that had heard what happened to cities that resisted sometimes submitted before the army arrived. But this strategy was also a structural trap. A system built on terror requires continuous demonstration to remain credible. A single successful resistance threatened to undermine the reputation on which the entire system rested. This created pressure toward continuous expansion that was structural rather than simply the product of individual royal ambition. Each Assyrian king inherited not just an empire, but a logic of empire that required him to keep expanding, keep demonstrating irresistibility, or risk the unraveling that perceived weakness would accelerate. In the Levant, the Assyrian reorganization went deeper than simply changing which rulers sat in which palaces. It changed the physical landscape of the region in ways that were designed to make Assyrian authority permanent rather than temporary. The Assyrian provincial administration invested in infrastructure throughout the territories it controlled. Roads connecting Levantine cities to the Assyrian heartland were maintained and extended. Administrative centers were established at key points along those roads. Tribute collection systems were formalized. The agricultural economy was reorganized around the tribute requirements of the empire rather than the subsistence needs of local communities. The Phoenician cities of the coast present a particularly instructive case study of how the Assyrian system interacted with existing Levantine commercial power. Tyre maintained a degree of functional independence, even under Assyrian dominance, that speaks to how clearly the Assyrian administration understood the commercial value of the Tyrian trading network. The Assyrian annals record periods of tension and even siege against Tyre. But the city was never destroyed in the way that inland cities that resisted were destroyed. The Assyrian calculation was straightforward. An empire that destroyed Tyre destroyed its own access to the commercial networks that Tyre operated. The Mediterranean trade routes, the purple dye revenues, The cedar timber operations. Some assets are more valuable intact than conquered. This pragmatic relationship between Assyrian military power and Phoenician commercial power shaped the Levant for nearly 2 centuries. The Phoenicians paid tribute. The Assyrians collected it and left the commercial infrastructure largely intact. Both sides understood the arrangement clearly, even when neither side particularly enjoyed it. Sennacherib's campaign into Judah in 701 BCE, the siege of Jerusalem and its outcome, is one of the most extensively documented events in ancient Near Eastern history. Preserved in multiple independent sources that can be compared with each other, Sennacherib's own prism inscription describes the campaign in detail, including the siege of Jerusalem and what he presents as Hezekiah's eventual submission. The biblical account in the second book of Kings describes the same events, but includes an episode in which the Assyrian army withdraws without taking the city. The Greek historian Herodotus preserves yet another version of the story. Scholars have examined these different accounts carefully. The most defensible assessment is that the siege happened, that Jerusalem was not taken, and that the Assyrian army withdrew for reasons that the different sources describe through their own interpretive frameworks. Whether disease, logistical problems, political developments elsewhere in the empire, or some combination of these factors, caused the withdrawal is not definitively established by the available evidence. What is clear is that Jerusalem survived while 46 other Judean cities, by Sennacherib's own count, did not. The survival of Jerusalem became, in the Judean tradition, a foundational moment in understanding the limits of imperial power. It was not understood primarily as a military or political achievement, and that interpretation, whatever one makes of its theological claims, had consequences that outlasted the Assyrian Empire by a considerable margin. The Assyrian Empire did not last. Nineveh fell in 612 BCE to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The empire that had seemed the permanent master of the ancient Near East was gone within a generation of its greatest geographic extent. What it left behind in the Levant was complicated and permanent. The deportations had changed the demographic composition of several regions in ways that did not reverse when Assyrian power collapsed. The Israelite kingdom of the north did not reconstitute itself. The communities deported by Sargon II did not return as a cohesive group. The physical landscape of the Levant had been reorganized around Assyrian provincial needs in ways that shaped the region for generations after the empire itself was gone, and the tradition shaped by the people the Assyrian hammer had struck. The theological and literary tradition preserved by the communities that had survived by submitting, by resisting, by calculating and recalculating their position in a world dominated by overwhelming force. That tradition proved harder than iron and more durable than any palace wall. The lions in the relief carving are still dying on the wall of the British Museum. The king who commissioned the carving is gone. The empire he ruled is gone. The people whose cities that empire reorganized continued to carry their traditions forward through every subsequent upheaval. That is not a comfortable irony for anyone who wants history to deliver simple moral lessons, but it is the one history actually delivers. Chapter 8. Babylon, Persia, and the Art of Tolerant Empire. There is a woman sitting beside a canal in Babylonia in the year 580 BCE. She is not young. The march from Jerusalem took months. And the years before that, the years of siege and uncertainty and watching everything her family had built slowly come apart, have left marks that do not fade. She is sitting at the edge of the water because the water reminds her of nothing in particular, which is a relief. The rivers of Babylon do not look like the hills of Judah. The flat, irrigated plain, stretching in every direction, does not look like anything she has ever seen before. This is, she has decided, useful. It is easier to think clearly in a landscape that carries no memories. She is thinking about God, not in the abstract way that theology sometimes permits. She is thinking about God in the specific, urgent way of someone whose entire framework for understanding the divine has just been challenged in the most concrete possible terms. The temple is gone. The city is gone. The king is gone. Everything that her tradition had told her was the visible evidence of divine favor and divine presence has been destroyed by the army of a foreign king. And she is sitting beside a canal in a foreign country, trying to work out what, if anything, that means. She does not know that the answer she and her community will develop over the next 50 years will become one of the most consequential ideas in the history of human religion. She is just trying to understand what happened, and why, and whether the story is over or whether it is somehow still going. The story, as it turned out, was still going. But before we follow it forward, we need to understand the empire that brought her here. And to understand that empire, we need to start with what came before it. The transition from Assyrian dominance to Babylonian dominance in the Levant did not, at first, represent any fundamental change in the logic of how great powers dealt with smaller ones. Nebuchadnezzar II, who brought Babylon to the height of its power in the early 6th century BCE, was not a gentler ruler than his Assyrian predecessors. He was a different kind of ruler, with different priorities and a different style, but the fundamental experience of being on the receiving end of his military campaigns was not substantially more comfortable than the experience of Assyrian conquest. The Levant learned this in stages. After the fall of Nineveh, in 612 BCE, the Levantine states that had survived under Assyrian dominance found themselves in a familiar position. A great power had collapsed. The regional balance of power was suddenly uncertain. New calculations were required. Egypt, under the 26th dynasty, moved quickly to reassert its traditional interest in the Levant, marching north to fill the vacuum that Assyrian collapse had created. The Babylonians, under Nabopolassar and then his son Nebuchadnezzar, moved west to contest that reassertion. The decisive moment came at Carchemish, on the upper Euphrates, in 605 BCE. The Battle of Carchemish ended in a Babylonian victory so complete that it effectively ended Egyptian military ambitions in the Levant for a generation. The ancient world had a new master, and the Levant, as always, had to adjust. Judah made the adjustment badly. The kingdom oscillated between submission to Babylon and overtures to Egypt in a pattern that Nebuchadnezzar eventually lost patience with entirely. The first Babylonian campaign against Jerusalem in 597 BCE resulted in the deportation of the king Jehoiakim and a significant portion of the Judean elite to Babylon. A new king, Zedekiah, was installed as a Babylonian client. When Zedekiah also moved toward Egypt and revolt, Nebuchadnezzar's response was definitive. The siege of Jerusalem, that began in 589 BCE, lasted roughly 2.5 years. When the walls finally failed in 587 BCE, the Babylonian army entered the city. The Temple of Solomon, which had stood for roughly 4 centuries, was burned. The palace was burned. The walls of the city were demolished. A significant portion of the remaining population was marched to Babylon. Zedekiah was captured trying to flee. His sons were killed in front of him. Then his eyes were put out, so that the last thing he ever saw was the death of his children. He was taken to Babylon in chains. This was not subtle. It was the demonstration that Nebuchadnezzar was capable of making when he decided that a client state had exhausted his patience. But the Babylonian approach to the populations they deported was, in important ways, different from the Assyrian approach. The Judean exiles in Babylon were not scattered across the empire, and mixed with other displaced populations in the systematic way that the Assyrians had dispersed the Israelite deportees after the fall of Samaria. They were settled together in communities along the irrigation canals of Babylonia, where they maintained their social organization, their religious practices, their language, and their connections to each other across the decades of their exile. The Babylonian administrative records from this period include documents mentioning Judean exiles by name in the context of ration distributions, land grants, and commercial transaction. These documents suggest a community with real economic agency and real social coherence, not simply a labor pool absorbed into the general population. This relative coherence had consequences that Nebuchadnezzar almost certainly did not intend. Because the Judean exiles maintained their community structure, they were able to maintain and develop their religious and literary tradition in ways that a scattered and broken community could not have managed. The decades of the Babylonian exile are, in the view of most scholars of the Hebrew Bible, among the most creatively productive periods in the development of the biblical tradition. Texts were compiled and edited and given the forms that would make them canonical. Theological arguments were developed in response to the specific challenge that exile posed. This brings us back to the woman sitting beside the canal. The answer her community developed to the question she was asking was not the obvious one. The obvious answer, the one that most ancient communities gave when their city was destroyed and their temple burned, was that their God had been defeated by the God of the conqueror. The Judean tradition reached for a different answer. If the God of Israel was truly the creator of all things, then the Babylonian conquest was not the defeat of the God of Israel by Marduk. It was the God of Israel using Babylon as an instrument of judgment against a people who had been unfaithful to their covenant obligations. The conqueror was not the victor. The conqueror was the tool. This theological move required an extraordinary expansion of the concept of God. A deity who can use a foreign empire as his instrument is a deity whose sovereignty extends over all nations, not just his own people. It created the template for a portable faith, a tradition that could survive and flourish without any of the political and institutional structures that had previously seemed to be its necessary foundations. Nebuchadnezzar did not intend to create the conditions for this. He intended to demonstrate power and extract compliance. But the specific way his power was exercised created a space in which something unexpected and enduring grew. Then, in 539 BCE, Babylon fell to Cyrus II of Persia, and the logic of empire shifted in a way that was visible enough to be recorded by multiple different traditions, each of which interpreted what happened according to its own framework, but all of which agreed on the basic fact. Something different was happening. The Cyrus cylinder, the clay document found in the ruins of Babylon and now housed in the British Museum, presents the Persian conquest of Babylon as a religious restoration rather than a military conquest. Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, had chosen Cyrus as his instrument because the previous Babylonian king Nabonidus had failed in his religious obligations. Cyrus was not positioned as a conqueror. He was positioned as a liberator, restoring the proper divine order that Nabonidus had disrupted. This framing was propaganda, carefully crafted by Babylonian scribes serving their new Persian masters. But it was also something more than propaganda. It was a statement of policy. The Persians intended to rule Babylon as Babylonians, not as foreign conquerors imposing an alien order. Cyrus would participate in the religious rituals of the city. He would maintain the temples. He would present himself in terms that Babylonian tradition recognized as legitimate. Cyrus used tolerance not only as mercy, but as imperial strategy. This is the key distinction that separates the Persian approach from the Assyrian one. The Assyrian approach to conquered peoples was fundamentally transformative. It sought to reshape them, to relocate them, to disrupt their cultural coherence. This approach produced compliance and extracted tribute and suppressed organized resistance. But it also generated a level of resentment that, combined with the structural pressures of maintaining an expansion-dependent empire, contributed significantly to the Assyrian collapse. The Persian approach rested on different assumptions. Instead of seeking to transform conquered peoples into something more convenient, the Persians sought to incorporate them as they were, preserving their religious institutions, their cultural practices, their local administrative structures, presenting Persian rule as the guarantor of those local traditions rather than their replacement. This required the ability to present the same ruler as the chosen instrument of Marduk in Babylon, and as the anointed one of the God of Israel in Judea, and as the legitimate successor to the pharaohs in Egypt. Each claim made in the cultural language that the relevant community would recognize as valid. For the Levant, the practical consequences of the Persian conquest of Babylon were immediate and significant. Cyrus issued what the Hebrew Bible records as a decree permitting the Judean exiles to return to their homeland and to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. The consensus position among scholars is that the Persian policy of permitting such returns was real and documented, even if the specific form of the biblical account reflects later theological interpretation of what the policy meant and why it was issued. The return from exile happened in waves rather than as a single event, bringing communities back to a Judea that had been significantly changed by half a century of Babylonian rule. The rebuilt temple that eventually rose in Jerusalem was not the Temple of Solomon. It was a more modest structure, built by a community that was demographically reduced and politically subordinate to Persian imperial authority. But it was a temple, and the community that gathered around it had been transformed by the exile experience in ways that made it, in some respects, more theologically coherent and more intellectually vigorous than the community that had been deported 50 years earlier. The woman beside the canal eventually went home, or her children did, or her grandchildren. The journey back was not simple, and the home they returned to was not the home that had been left, but the tradition they carried with them, shaped in the specific crucible of exile and loss and the theological questions that exile forced, was more durable than the walls of any city. That is what Babylon inadvertently produced, and that is what Persia, with its policy of tolerance as strategy, allowed to survive. The Assyrian approach created compliance through fear. The Babylonian approach created, accidentally, one of the most consequential theological developments in human history. The Persian approach created stability through respect for local identity. Each of these empires was teaching the ancient world a lesson about power. The students were paying attention. Chapter 9. Alexander and the Greek Moment. Picture an island. It sits perhaps half a mile off the Lebanese coast, close enough to the mainland that on a clear day you can read the details of the buildings on the shore, far enough that the water between island and coast is deep enough for the largest ships of the ancient world to navigate safely. The island is the city of Tyre, one of the oldest and wealthiest cities in the Phoenician world. Its harbour is one of the finest in the eastern Mediterranean. Its purple dye workshops and its commercial networks have been operating for centuries. In the winter of 332 BCE, a 23-year-old Macedonian king stood on the mainland shore, looked at that island, and made a decision that his generals almost certainly considered unwise. He was going to build a road to it. Not a bridge, not a line of boats lashed together. A road. A causeway of stone and timber extending from the shore into the sea, half a mile across open water. wide enough to move siege engines to the walls of a city that had never been taken by force, because it had always been beyond the reach of land armies. The project took 7 months. Alexander used the rubble of the old mainland city of Tyre, abandoned when the population moved to the island centuries earlier, as foundation material. His engineers designed the causeway to withstand the coastal currents. The Tyrians did everything they could to stop it. They sent fire ships against the work. They sent divers to cut the timber piles. They used artillery from the walls to kill the workers. The causeway kept coming. When it finally reached the walls of the island city, Alexander had assembled a fleet from the Phoenician cities that had submitted to his authority earlier in the campaign. The assault came from the water and from the causeway simultaneously. The walls, built to resist naval attack, had not been designed to resist the combination of siege towers on a causeway and warships equipped with their own artillery bearing down from 2 directions at once. Tyre fell. What Alexander did to it reflected the cost and the frustration of a 7-month siege. The men of military age who survived the assault were killed. The women and children were sold into slavery. A city that had been one of the great commercial centers of the ancient world for 1,000 years was devastated in the days following its fall. The causeway Alexander built did not wash away when he moved on. The sediment that accumulated around it over the following centuries turned what had been an island into a peninsula. The modern city of Tyre, called Sur in Arabic, sits on that peninsula today, connected to the Lebanese mainland by the physical legacy of Alexander's engineering. You can see it clearly on any satellite image of the Lebanese coast. The siege of Tyre tells you something important about Alexander that more flattering accounts of his career sometimes smooth over. He was capable of extraordinary strategic creativity and equally extraordinary ruthlessness. And he deployed both without apparent internal conflict between them. The decision to build the causeway was genuinely brilliant. The destruction that followed the city's fall was a deliberate choice, made by a man who understood that the treatment of one city that chose extended resistance would communicate a precise message to every other city, calculating whether to resist or submit. What was distinctive about Alexander, beyond the military brilliance, was the genuine intellectual curiosity and cultural engagement that his education under the philosopher Aristotle had developed, and that expressed itself throughout his campaigns in ways that set him apart from the straightforward conquerors who had preceded him in the Levant. The campaign that brought Alexander to the Levant had begun in 334 BCE, when he crossed from Macedonia into Asia with an army that scholarly estimates, which vary depending on the sources consulted, place at roughly 40,000 men. The Persian Empire, which had seemed the permanent and irresistible master of the ancient world for 2 centuries, proved unable to stop him. The Battle of Issus in 333 BCE ended in a Persian defeat so complete that the Persian king, Darius III, fled the battlefield, leaving behind his family, his treasury, and the last substantial remnant of his credibility as a military commander. After Issus, Alexander turned south rather than pursuing Darius directly. His strategic reasoning was sound. Before he moved deeper into Persian territory, he needed to secure the eastern Mediterranean coast to protect his supply lines and deny the Persian navy its operating bases. The Levant was not a detour from his main campaign. It was a necessary preliminary to everything that followed. Most Levantine cities made the calculation that submission was preferable to resistance. The Phoenician cities of Sidon and Byblos submitted without conflict. The kings of Cyprus sent their fleets to join Alexander's growing naval force. Only Tyre refused, which led to the 7-month siege we have already described. Egypt received Alexander as a liberator. Alexander presented himself, in Egyptian terms, as the legitimate pharaoh, the son of the gods, the restorer of proper divine order. Following the Persian precedent established by Cyrus, he made offerings at the temple of the god Ptah at Memphis. He visited the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis in the western desert, and emerged, presenting himself as the son of Amun, a claim that connected to Zeus in the Greek theological framework and to the most powerful deity in the Egyptian one simultaneously. This was the Persian strategy of incorporated diversity taken to its logical extreme by a ruler with more theological flexibility than most. Alexander understood that legitimacy was not a single fixed thing. It was something that different communities recognized in different terms. And the ruler, who could speak in multiple legitimating languages simultaneously, held a political advantage that purely military strength could not replace. Alexander left Egypt in 331 BCE and marched east to confront Darius a second time. The Battle of Gaugamela ended in another Persian defeat, so complete that the Persian Empire, as a functioning political entity, effectively ceased to exist. Alexander continued east, through Persia, through Central Asia, into the Indian subcontinent, until his army refused to go further and he turned back. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, at around 32 or 33 years of age, before he had resolved the fundamental question of what the empire he had built was actually for. The Levant, which he had passed through in 332 BCE, was now part of that empire. And what happened to it after Alexander died was not simple conquest or simple continuity, but a cultural process that scholars call Hellenization, whose effects on the Levant were deep, lasting, and deeply contested by the people who experienced them. Hellenization was not a policy in the way that Assyrian deportation or Persian tolerance was a policy. It was a process. The spread of Greek language, Greek cultural practices, Greek architectural forms, and Greek ways of organizing urban life through the networks that Alexander's conquests had opened. It happened because the ruling class of the successor kingdoms was Macedonian and Greek, because the administrative language of those kingdoms was Greek, and because participation in the cultural life of the new order required familiarity with Greek culture. In the Levant, the process took forms that varied significantly depending on the community and the context. In the port cities, with existing commercial relationships with the Greek world, Hellenistic culture spread with a pragmatic openness that the Phoenicians had always shown toward useful outside influences. In the Jewish communities of Judea and the larger diaspora, the process was more contested. Greek culture came with a worldview that was in genuine tension with the theological framework that the exile experience had produced. The Maccabean revolt of the 160s BCE, which resulted in the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty and is commemorated in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, was partly a military revolt against the Seleucid rulers who controlled Judea, but it was also, and perhaps more fundamentally, a revolt about the terms of cultural engagement, about how far Hellenization could go before it ceased to be adaptation and became dissolution, the internal debate it produced, about the relationship between tradition and innovation, between particular identity and universal culture, is still being conducted in different forms by every community that finds itself in contact with a powerful dominant culture. Alexander brought the Greek world east, but the encounter was not one-directional. The east moved west as well. In the religious ideas and cultural practices that flowed through the networks, the conquest had opened. The ideas that would eventually move from the eastern Mediterranean into the heart of the Roman Empire, and from there into the world, were ideas that had been developing in the meeting zone between Greek philosophical tradition and the religious cultures of Syria, Judea, and Egypt for generations before Rome inherited the territory. The causeway Alexander built to reach the island of Tyre is still there, under the modern peninsula of Syria. The island he crossed it to destroy has been absorbed into the mainland by the sediment of 23 centuries. He changed the geography of the Levant. He changed the cultural geography even more thoroughly. But the people who had always lived at the crossroads absorbed that change, the way they had always absorbed every change that came through. Selectively, purposefully, on their own terms. Chapter 10. Rome's province Syria as the empire's eastern nerve. What Rome did not understand about Syria, it understood everywhere else. It understood roads. The Roman engineers, who arrived with Pompey's legions in 63 BCE, looked at a landscape that merchants had been crossing for 4,000 years and began immediately to do what Roman engineers always did. They measured. They graded. They laid flat stone surfaces wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other, with drainage channels cut into the shoulders and milestones marking the distance to the nearest town. They built bridges over the rivers and way stations at regular intervals. Within a generation, every significant city in Syria and the Levant was connected into a single network that could move troops, tax revenue, dispatches, and commercial goods with an efficiency that the ancient world had never seen applied at this scale. What the roads could not move was the thing that Syria had been producing for 4,000 years before Rome arrived. They could not move the ideas, the religious innovations, the cultural syntheses, the ways of thinking about God and justice, and the relationship between the human and the divine that had been developing at the eastern end of the Mediterranean since before Egypt was an empire. Those things moved on their own, quietly, through the very networks that Rome had built to serve its own purposes. Rome built the roads to govern Syria. Syria used the roads to change Rome. That reversal is the thread running through the entire story of Rome and Syria. It is what makes this province genuinely remarkable, rather than simply another chapter in the familiar story of conquest and administration. The Roman annexation of Syria was not accompanied by the systematic destruction that Assyrian conquest had brought, or the cultural transformation that Alexander's campaign had initiated. Pompey organized existing political arrangements into a provincial structure, left local rulers who acknowledged Roman authority generally in place, and moved on to deal with Judea, where a dispute between competing Hasmonean claimants gave him a pretext for intervention he did not hesitate to use. What Rome brought to Syria was stability, the specific kind of stability that comes from being part of an empire large enough that no external threat can seriously challenge it. For a region that had been the battlefield of competing empires for centuries, this represented something genuinely new, not peace in the absolute sense. The borders of the Syrian province faced constant pressure from the Parthian and later the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east, and the eastern frontier was never entirely quiet, but an internal stability that allowed agriculture, commerce, and urban life to develop without the constant disruption of imperial competition. Syria, under Roman rule, became one of the wealthiest provinces in the empire. The agricultural wealth of the region, the grain of the inland plains, the olive oil and wine of the coastal hills, flowed into the Roman economic system in quantities that made the province a significant contributor to imperial revenues. The commercial cities of the coast expanded their trade networks across the Mediterranean with an energy that the Hellenistic period had begun, but that Roman stability allowed to develop more fully. Antioch, the city that the Seleucid kings had founded on the Orontes River in northwestern Syria, became under Roman rule one of the largest cities in the empire. Scholarly estimates of its population in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE range from 200,000 to 400,000 people, with genuine uncertainty in those figures given the difficulty of reconstructing ancient urban populations from available evidence. Whatever the precise number, Antioch was by any measure one of the great cosmopolitan centers of the ancient world, a city where Greek and Aramaic and Latin were all heard in the same streets, where merchants from across the known world maintained establishments, and where the cultural and religious diversity of the Eastern Mediterranean was visible on every block. Now watch what Syria did with the access that Roman rule provided. The roads that Roman administrators built to move troops and tax revenues became the roads on which the first Christian missionaries traveled. The Greek language that Roman administration had inherited from the Hellenistic period was the language in which the texts of the New Testament were written, allowing them to be read across a vast geographic area without translation. The movement that began among the followers of Jesus of Nazareth in the Roman province of Judea spread through exactly the networks that Roman rule had created, reaching Antioch, reaching Rome itself, reaching the edges of the empire and beyond, using Roman infrastructure to carry ideas that would eventually transform Roman civilization from within. The relationship between the early Christian movement and Roman authority was initially hostile, as the persecutions of the 1st and 2nd centuries document. But the features of Roman imperial organization that made Christianity vulnerable to persecution also made it extraordinarily effective at propagating itself. By the 4th century CE, the Emperor Constantine had made Christianity the favored religion of the Roman state. The Eastern Mediterranean crossroads had sent its most consequential idea all the way to the center of the empire that thought it was governing the crossroads. The province of Syria provided Rome with more than a new religion. It sent the empire emperors. The Severan dynasty, which ruled Rome from 193 to 235 CE, had its roots in the Levant in a way that permanently changed what it meant to be Roman at the highest level. Septimius Severus, who founded the dynasty, was from North Africa. His wife, Julia Domna, was from Emesa in Syria, daughter of the high priest of the sun god Elagabal. She became one of the most politically influential women in Roman imperial history, gathering at Rome a court of philosophers, scientists, and literary figures that made the Severan court one of the most intellectually active in the empire's history. Her niece, Julia Mamaea, effectively governed the empire as regent for her son, Alexander Severus, in the 220s CE. The Syrian women of the Severan dynasty exercised real power in Rome, not as exceptions to the normal order of things, but through the specific combination of dynastic connection, personal intelligence, and political skill that the circumstances of the later empire permitted. The grandson of Julia Domna's sister, the young emperor known to history as Elagabalus, went further than any of them in making visible what Syria was doing to Rome. He brought the sacred black stone of his ancestral sun god from Emesa to Rome, built it a temple on the Palatine Hill, and attempted to reorganize the Roman religious hierarchy around a Syrian deity. The Romans found this experiment sufficiently unwelcome that Elagabalus was assassinated in 222 CE. But the episode illustrates, in unusually concentrated form, the extent to which Syria had become not just a province that Rome administered, but a cultural force actively shaping Roman identity. Rome controlled Syria with legions and roads and taxes and governors. Syria influenced Rome with merchants and priests and imperial wives and religious ideas that traveled so quietly through the networks of the empire that no one in Rome quite noticed, until they looked up one day and realized that the empire they had built on Italian foundations was being sustained and transformed by something that had grown from the crossroads of the ancient world. They always think they are governing the crossroads. The crossroads is always, simultaneously, governing them. Chapter 11. The Sacred Crossroads: How Geography Shaped Religious History. In the city of Antioch, sometime around the middle of the 1st century CE, something unremarkable and world-changing happened at the same time. A small community of people gathered in someone's house. They were not powerful people. They included craftsmen, merchants, some freed slaves, possibly a few members of the local educated class. They spoke Greek. They had come from different backgrounds, some Jewish, some not. And they were trying to work out together what it meant to follow the teachings of a Jewish teacher from Galilee who had been executed by the Roman authorities roughly 20 years earlier, and whom his followers believed had risen from the dead in Antioch, according to early Christian tradition, preserved in the Acts of the Apostles. These people were first called Christians. It happened in a Syrian city, at the Crossroads, as almost everything consequential in the religious history of the ancient world happened, somewhere in the zone between the Mediterranean and the desert, in the narrow strip of land that geography had made the intersection of the ancient world for thousands of years before that particular gathering took place. The question worth asking is not why this particular moment happened in Antioch. It is why this region, across a span of more than 3,000 years, produced the religious innovations that would shape more human lives than any military conquest or political arrangement in the history of the world. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all developed in close relationship with the wider Near Eastern crossroads. Islam emerged in the Arabian Peninsula, in the cities of Mecca and Medina, where, according to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad received his revelation in the early 7th century CE. Christianity emerged from within the Jewish tradition in the Roman province of Judea and spread first through the Syrian cities. Judaism developed across thousands of years of history, centered in the highland kingdoms of the southern Levant, shaped profoundly by its encounters with Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Persian civilization. These are distinct traditions with distinct origins, but they share foundational ideas that did not appear independently or by coincidence. They appeared in a zone of the ancient world where, for thousands of years, ideas from multiple different civilizations had been meeting, competing, combining, and producing new syntheses at a rate that more isolated regions could not match. The key insight is this: the Levant was the place where people who believed fundamentally different things about the nature of reality were in constant, unavoidable contact with each other. The Egyptian merchant who came to buy cedar brought a theological tradition in which the pharaoh was a god. The Mesopotamian trader, arriving to sell copper, carried a worldview in which multiple gods governed different aspects of existence. The Hittite diplomat, negotiating in a Canaanite palace, came from a tradition that recognized hundreds of gods and was remarkably willing to add new ones, when political circumstances suggested the value of doing so. All of these people were unavoidable neighbors. And when you live where your beliefs are contested by the visible presence of different beliefs, you are required to think about them more carefully, to articulate why they are true in terms that can be defended against alternatives, to develop the theological arguments that make your tradition not just a custom but a conviction. The development of Israelite monotheism, the belief in a single God who is the creator of the universe and the sovereign of all peoples, is the most consequential example of this process that the ancient Levant produced. Scholars who study the development of Israelite religion understand it as a process that took centuries and was shaped at every stage by the specific political and cultural circumstances of the community developing it. The earliest layers of the biblical tradition reflect a religious world more complex than later monotheism would acknowledge. The texts preserve traces of a worldview in which the God of Israel was understood as a God among gods, the particular patron deity of a particular people. The commandment not to worship other gods does not assert that other gods do not exist. It asserts that the people of Israel should not worship them. That is a different claim. The shift toward full monotheism, the assertion that there is only one God and that the gods of other nations are not gods at all, is most clearly visible in the later prophetic literature, particularly in the writings attributed to the prophet known as Second Isaiah, who wrote during the Babylonian exile. The exile was the crucible in which this theological development was forged. A community that had organized its religious life around a temple in a specific city had to rethink fundamental assumptions when the temple was gone and the city was rubble. The answer the tradition reached, as we have already seen, was not the obvious one. If the God of Israel was truly the creator of all things, then the Babylonian conquest was not the defeat of the God of Israel by Marduk. It was the God of Israel using Babylon as an instrument of judgment. The conqueror was the tool. This theological move created a deity of a fundamentally different order from the local patron gods of ancient Near Eastern religion, and it created the template for a portable faith, a tradition that could survive and flourish without any of the political and institutional structures that had previously seemed to be its necessary foundations. The Christian tradition inherited this portable monotheism and added to it a specific claim about the nature of God's engagement with human history that extended its reach further still. The claim that God had entered human history in a particular human being made the tradition universally applicable in a way that the earlier Jewish framework had not been structured to be. The early community in Antioch gathered in someone's house, speaking Greek, trying to work out what this meant. Was the Crossroads doing what the Crossroads had always done, taking influences from multiple directions, combining them into something new, and sending that new thing outward through the networks that the Crossroads commanded? Islam, emerging in the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century CE, drew on both the Jewish and Christian traditions that had preceded it. Acknowledging the prophets of the Hebrew Bible and Jesus as prophets within a longer revelatory tradition that found its culmination in the revelation to Muhammad, the theological synthesis that Islam achieved produced a tradition that spread with remarkable speed across an enormous geographic area. Within a century of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, the Islamic world extended from Spain to the borders of Central Asia. The Levant, birthplace of the Christian tradition and homeland of the Jewish tradition, became part of the Islamic world in the 7th century CE, a transition that came with the Arab conquests following Muhammad's death, changing the political and eventually the linguistic character of the region in ways that persist to the present day. The deeper answer to why this region produced these traditions comes back to what this entire story has been about. A community that has been repeatedly conquered and displaced and forced to rethink its identity in the aftermath of catastrophe learns something that communities living in more stable circumstances do not learn in the same way. It learns that identity has to be maintained through something more durable than political power or institutional structure. It learns to build portable, a tradition that can survive without a temple, without a king, without a homeland, is a tradition that can travel, and a tradition that can travel is a tradition that can change the world. The small community in Antioch did not know that they were at the beginning of something that would reach every continent. They were just people in a house in a Syrian city, trying to understand what had happened to them, and what it meant, and how to live in its light. That is all any of us are ever doing. The Crossroads simply gave them an unusually clear view of the question. Chapter 12. Zenobia's Gamble, Palmyra, and the Price of Independence. The 3 centuries between the community in Antioch and the story we are about to tell were centuries of enormous change across the entire Mediterranean world. The Roman Empire reached its greatest geographic extent, began to show the strains of that extent, and entered the sustained crisis of the 3rd century CE that tested every institution the ancient world had built. In the Levant, the old commercial networks adapted to Roman dominance. Aramaic continued to spread as the language of ordinary life, and the new religious traditions that had been born at the crossroads moved through the empire's roads and ports and marketplaces with a quiet persistence that no emperor quite knew how to stop. And in the middle of the Syrian desert, a city was growing rich. In the middle of the Syrian desert, roughly halfway between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean coast, there is an oasis. The water that makes it possible rises from springs deep underground, through limestone formations laid down before human beings existed, indifferent to the empires that would eventually build their ambitions on the surface above them, in a landscape of sand and rock and heat that can kill an unprepared traveler in hours. The oasis offers something that the desert around it conspicuously does not: water, shader, the specific combination of rest and resupply that makes the next stage of a long journey possible. The city that grew from this oasis was called Palmyra. The people who built it called it Tadmor, a name that appears in ancient texts going back to the 2nd millennium BCE. It sat at the intersection of the caravan routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean, routes that merchants had been walking for thousands of years before anyone thought to build a permanent settlement at the point where the desert crossing became possible. Every caravan moving between the Euphrates and the Syrian coast passed through Tadmor. Every merchant who needed water and shelter stopped there. The Romans, who incorporated Palmyra into their provincial system in the 1st century CE, understood its strategic value immediately. A city controlling the caravan routes connecting the Roman Empire with the Parthian Empire and beyond was not merely a commercial asset. It was a strategic position of the first order. The silk and spices and luxury goods that Roman aristocrats paid enormous sums to acquire passed through Palmyra. The city that managed that flow managed a piece of the economic nervous system of the ancient world. For roughly 2 centuries after its incorporation into the Roman system, Palmyra occupied a position of privileged commercial importance. Palmyrene merchants established trading colonies as far east as the Persian Gulf and as far west as the city of Rome itself. The distinctive funerary portraits of Palmyrene merchants and their families, carved in a style blending Roman and Parthian artistic conventions into something recognizably its own, have been found across an enormous geographic range. The city itself was transformed by this commercial wealth into something remarkable. A great colonnaded street lined with hundreds of columns stretched across the desert landscape, a temple dedicated to the god Bel, combining Near Eastern and Greco-Roman architectural elements in a synthesis that reflected the city's position between 2 worlds, rose at the center of the urban complex. A theater, an agora, monumental tower tombs rising at the city's edges. All of it paying silent testimony to the wealth that the caravan trade had generated and to the particular character of a city that had absorbed influences from every direction without being entirely defined by any of them. Palmyra was, in architectural terms, a visual argument for the Crossroads principle. Its buildings were neither purely Roman, nor purely Parthian, nor purely Semitic. They were Palmyrene, a synthesis that could only have been produced by a city sitting at the intersection of those 3 worlds. Among the leading families of Palmyra, in the middle decades of the 3rd century CE, one rose to extraordinary prominence. Septimius Odenathus became the dominant political figure of Palmyra in the 250s CE, building his power on a combination of commercial wealth, military capability, and a moment of imperial crisis so severe that the Roman emperor himself was desperate for capable partners. The crisis was the capture of the Roman emperor Valerian by the Sassanid Persian king Shapur I in 260 CE. This was one of the most humiliating events in Roman military history. Simultaneously, The Roman world was dealing with military pressure on multiple frontiers and a rapid succession of emperors who rarely lasted long enough to consolidate authority. The eastern provinces were effectively on their own. Odaenathus stepped into this vacuum with military effectiveness that the circumstances rewarded enormously. He organized Palmyrene forces and struck at the Sassanid army that had defeated Valerian, pursuing it back toward the Euphrates and recapturing territory that Rome had lost. The Roman Emperor Gallienus granted Odaenathus extraordinary titles and effective authority over the entire eastern portion of the empire. For several years, Palmyra functioned as the de facto power governing Rome's eastern provinces. Odaenathus had not rebelled against Rome. He had saved Rome, and his reward was the authority that saving it had made necessary. Then, in approximately 267 or 268 CE, Odaenathus was assassinated. The circumstances are not clearly documented in the surviving sources, and the identity of those responsible has been debated by scholars working with fragmentary and sometimes contradictory evidence. What is clear is that the assassination created a succession crisis, in which the dominant figure was not Odaenathus's designated heir, but his wife. Her name was Zenobia. She ruled as regent for her young son Vabilathus. But the evidence of the ancient sources suggests that real power was hers from the beginning. She was, by the accounts that survive, a woman of exceptional intelligence and personal force. She spoke multiple languages, including Aramaic, Greek, and Egyptian. She was educated in the philosophical tradition of the Hellenistic world, maintaining at her court a circle of intellectuals that included the philosopher Cassius Longinus, widely regarded as one of the leading scholars of his age. She hunted. She drank with her generals in the manner of the Macedonian military tradition. She presented herself in the style of a Hellenistic monarch, using the iconography of power that the Eastern Mediterranean world recognized as legitimate. She also claimed descent from Cleopatra. Whether that genealogical claim was historically accurate is a question the evidence cannot definitively answer, but its purpose is clear. Cleopatra had been the last independent ruler of a great Eastern kingdom before Roman absorption. By claiming her as an ancestor, Zenobia was positioning herself within a tradition of Eastern royal power that predated Roman dominance and could therefore, in principle, exist independently of it. In 270 CE, Zenobia made her move. Her general Zabdus led Palmyrene forces south into Egypt, the wealthiest province of the Roman Empire and the source of much of the grain that fed the city of Rome itself. Egypt fell without significant resistance. Palmyrene authority extended over the most economically important province in the Eastern Empire. The following year, Palmyrene forces moved north and west, taking control of the Roman provinces of Syria, Palestine, and much of Asia Minor. By approximately 271 CE, Zenobia controlled a territory stretching from the Euphrates to the borders of Libya, encompassing Egypt, the Levant, and large portions of what is now Turkey. She was ruling from her desert oasis city, an empire larger than any the Levant had produced since the height of Assyrian power. She declared her son Augustus the title of a Roman emperor. She took for herself the title of Augusta. She was no longer claiming to govern on Rome's behalf. She was claiming to govern in her own right, as the founder of an independent Eastern empire. The Roman Emperor Aurelian, who had been managing crises in the West when Zenobia made her move, was a man of extraordinary military capability and a very precise understanding of what Roman imperial authority required. The existence of an independent Eastern empire ruling Egypt and the Levant was not something a Roman emperor could accommodate. It was an existential challenge to the unity of the empire, and it had to be ended. Aurelian moved east in 272 CE, and the campaign that followed was decided in engagements fought in the vicinity of Palmyra. The Palmyrene military, effective against the Sassanids and against lightly defended Roman provinces, was not built for sustained engagement, with the full weight of a Roman army commanded by a capable emperor personally leading his forces. The cavalry that formed the core of Palmyrene military strength was outmaneuvered by Aurelian's combination of infantry discipline and strategic patience. Palmyra was besiegt. Zenobia attempted to flee eastward, toward the Euphrates and the Sassanid court, where she hoped to find refuge and support. She was captured before she reached the river. What happened to her afterward is a matter of genuine uncertainty in the ancient sources. The most commonly reported account suggests that she was taken to Rome, displayed in Aurelian's triumph, and then given a comfortable retirement near Tivoli, where she lived out the remainder of her life. Other ancient sources report that she died on the journey to Rome. The uncertainty is real, and scholars have not resolved it definitively. Palmyra itself did not survive intact. When a revolt broke out in the city after the initial Roman occupation, Aurelian returned and ordered a more thorough response. The city, that had been one of the great commercial centers of the ancient world, was stripped of much of its wealth. It never recovered its former prominence. The ruins that remained were, until recent times, among the most spectacular archaeological sites anywhere in the world. The colonnaded street, the Temple of Bel, the theatre, the Great Arch, the tower tombs rising at the city's edge in the Syrian desert, all of them preserving in stone the memory of a city that had been, for a brief and extraordinary moment, the center of an empire that challenged Rome for control of the eastern Mediterranean world. In 2015 CE, the extremist organization that had seized control of parts of Syria deliberately destroyed significant portions of the Palmyra ruins, including the Temple of Bel and the famous Arch. The ancient city that had survived Roman destruction 17 centuries earlier did not survive this more recent assault with its most iconic structures intact. The loss was real and irreversible for those specific monuments. But Zenobia's story survived. It has been told for 17 centuries, carried in the historical record by accounts that found in her ambition and her defeat a story that illuminates something permanent about the relationship between power and its limits. She was not the first ruler to challenge Rome from the east. She was not the first to be defeated by Rome's military capacity. What has made her story compelling to every generation that has told it since is not the scale of her ambition, though that was extraordinary, and not the completeness of her defeat, though that was complete. It is the quality of the attempt. Zenobia understood, with a clarity that her position at the Levantine crossroads had given her, that empires which last are the ones that offer something beyond military dominance. She built a court of intellectuals. She maintained multiple languages and multiple cultural traditions simultaneously. She connected herself to the history of the region in ways that went back centuries before Rome existed. She was making an argument. The argument that the Eastern Mediterranean world had its own traditions of sovereignty and cultural achievement that did not require Roman validation to be legitimate. The argument was defeated militarily, but it was not wrong. The springs that water the oasis of Palmyra are still flowing. They do not care about empires. They were there before the city was built, and they were there after it was destroyed, and they are there tonight, rising through the limestone in the Syrian desert, older than any of the stories we tell about the land above them. The water keeps rising. It always has. Chapter 13. What the Levant left behind. Come back to the beginning. There is a merchant standing at a crossroads. He has been standing there, in one form or another, for 6,000 years. The specific man changes. The donkeys become camels, become trucks, become container ships moving through the eastern Mediterranean under flags that would have been unrecognizable to every ruler whose story we have told tonight. The goods change, the languages change, but the crossroads does not change. The geography that made this strip of land between the sea and the desert, the intersection of the ancient world, is the same geography that makes it significant today. The land bridge between Africa and Asia is still there. The eastern end of the Mediterranean is still there. The trade routes still run through the same passes and the same river valleys that they have always run through, now carrying different vehicles, but following the same logic of least resistance that geography imposes on anyone trying to move goods and people across this terrain. What did the Levant actually leave behind? Start with the alphabet. The writing system you are using to process these words. The system that underlies every Latin alphabet language on Earth. Descended in a traceable and documented line from the Phoenician alphabet that merchants in the Lebanese port cities developed and spread through their commercial networks in the early 1st millennium BCE. This is a straightforward fact of linguistic history. The alphabet was a technology. The Phoenicians spread it. The Greeks adapted it and added vowel markers. The Romans adapted the Greek version. The rest of the world, or a very large part of it, eventually adopted the Roman version. Every word written in a Latin alphabet language is, in the most literal sense, the living downstream consequence of decisions made by Phoenician merchants roughly 3,000 years ago about the most efficient way to keep track of their shipments. They did not know they were giving the world its alphabet. They were just trying to count their bolts of purple cloth more reliably. That is often how the most consequential things happen. Not through grand intention, but through practical necessity. Applied consistently. Spreading further than anyone expected. Move from the alphabet to written law. The legal, commercial, and diplomatic texts, preserved at Ugarit and at other sites across the ancient Levant, document something important about the long development of written, legal, and commercial practice in the ancient world. Ugarit, in particular, before its destruction in the Bronze Age collapse, was producing written contracts, treaties, and legal decisions in forms that reflect a sophisticated tradition of written, commercial, and diplomatic law. The idea that the rules governing human relationships should be written down, publicly available, and applied consistently. An idea developed and transmitted across this region, among others, was among the most consequential contributions to the subsequent history of governance. The religious legacy is the most consequential and the most complex to characterize fairly. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam together account for the religious allegiance of a majority of humanity by many modern estimates. All three traditions developed in close relationship with the Near Eastern crossroads. The specific theological innovations that made these traditions so portable and so durable. The strict monotheism that required no specific temple or political structure to survive. The concept of a God who acts in history and whose purposes extend beyond any particular people or place. The idea that the relationship between the divine and the human is mediated through text and community rather than through ritual performance in a specific sacred location. All of these innovations emerged from the specific historical experience of communities in the Levant and its wider region. The theology reflects the history, and the history is the history of the Levant. Beyond the alphabet and the law and the religious traditions, the Levant left behind something harder to name, but equally real. It left behind a set of practical lessons about how communities survive under sustained pressure. The Levant taught the ancient world that identity can be maintained without a homeland. The Jewish communities that survived the Babylonian exile, the dispersal that followed the Roman destruction of the temple, and the long centuries of diaspora existence demonstrated across nearly 3,000 years that a community's sense of itself does not ultimately depend on political sovereignty or a specific geographic location. It depends on shared text, shared practice, shared memory, and shared commitment to transmitting those things from one generation to the next, with sufficient care that the thread of continuity is not broken, even when everything else seems to be breaking. This is not a small lesson. It is one of the most important lessons about the resilience of human communities that history offers. The Levant also demonstrated, repeatedly and at great cost, the limits of what empires can actually accomplish in a crossroads region. Egypt tried to hold it as a system of client states and found that the clients had their own interests. Assyria tried to hold it through deportation and terror and produced a level of resentment that contributed to its own eventual collapse. Babylon held it briefly and inadvertently created the conditions for one of the most significant theological developments in human history. Persia held it through tolerance and produced 2 centuries of relative stability. Alexander swept through it and transformed its cultural landscape, but could not stay to consolidate what he had created. Rome held it for centuries and found that it was being changed by the province it thought it was governing. Every one of these empires learned, sooner or later, that the crossroads has its own logic and its own momentum. The people who live at the intersection of the world are not passive recipients of the power that moves through them. They are participants. They are agents. They are, in their own way, always negotiating the terms of whatever domination they are currently living under. There is a kind of resilience that develops in a community that has been at the crossroads long enough. It is not the resilience of the fortress, the capacity to resist assault from outside. Fortresses fall. Every fortress in this story eventually fell. It is the resilience of the river, the capacity to find a way through whatever obstacles the landscape presents, to maintain the direction of flow while adapting to the specific terrain of the moment without losing the essential current. The communities of the Levant have been practicing this kind of resilience for 6,000 years. The specific political arrangements have changed beyond recognition. The empires that seemed permanent have come and gone. The languages have shifted, and shifted again. The religious traditions have developed and divided, and developed further. The landscape itself has changed. The forests cleared. The rivers redirected. The coastline altered by centuries of human activity. What has not changed is the crossroads, and what has not changed is the fundamental human challenge that the crossroads poses. The challenge of maintaining identity and community and purpose in a world that is constantly moving through you, constantly bringing new pressures and new influences and new demands for adaptation. The answer that the Levant developed to that challenge, refined across 4,000 years of practice, was not a wall. It was a conversation, a continuous engagement with the forces moving through the crossroads, absorbing what was useful, resisting what was destructive, transmitting what was essential to the next generation with enough clarity and enough force that the thread of continuity was not broken even when everything else seemed to be. That conversation is still happening. In the cities of the Levant today, in communities scattered across the world that trace their origins to this particular strip of coast and highland and desert, in the traditions that emerged from this crossroads and travelled further than any empire that tried to hold it. The conversation is still happening. The most valuable thing the Levant left behind is not in any museum. It is not carved into any temple wall. It is not preserved in any archive, though the archives are remarkable. It is the knowledge of how to keep going when everything you built has been taken from you, the knowledge of how to carry what matters inside you when you cannot carry it any other way, the knowledge that the crossroads does not belong to whoever is standing on it at any given moment. but to the movement itself, to the endless human project of exchange and adaptation and transmission that the Crossroads makes possible and that no empire has ever managed to stop. That is what the Levant left behind, and it is still here. Closing. Come back to the Crossroads. The merchant is still standing there. The afternoon light is doing what light does in the Levant, falling across the limestone hills at an angle that makes everything look older and more permanent than it actually is. The sea is behind him, catching the last warmth of the day. The desert is ahead, patient and vast and full of the routes that his family has been walking for as long as anyone can remember. He knows that the empires will keep coming. Egypt came, Assyria came, Babylon came, Persia came, Greece came, Rome came, others came after Rome, and after those others, still more. He knows this the way he knows the seasons. From long experience of patterns that repeat without ever repeating exactly, he knows something else too. Something that the empires have never quite managed to learn, no matter how many times history has tried to teach it. The Crossroads does not belong to whoever is standing on it at any particular moment. It belongs to the movement itself. He picks up his reins. His donkeys are patient animals, accustomed to long days and uncertain roads. The route going east is longer, but the connections at the end of it are older and deeper than any political arrangement currently in force. He knows the names of the families he will meet there. Their grandfathers knew his grandfathers. That network of mutual knowledge and mutual obligation is worth more than any treaty signed in a palace he has never visited. He thinks briefly of his son, the one who became a merchant instead of a farmer, who is somewhere on these same roads tonight, carrying his own pack and making his own calculations. The boy made the right choice. In the end, some knowledge has to be learned by walking. You cannot inherit it, and you cannot be taught it in any classroom. You learn it from the road itself, from the specific weight of a pack after 11 days, from the way the light falls on the limestone hills at the end of a long afternoon, from the faces of the families who open their doors to you in the desert because their fathers opened their doors to your father, and because that is simply how this world has always worked. He turns east. The desert opens in front of him like a door. 6,000 years of history stand behind him. He does not carry it as a burden. He carries it the way his people have always carried everything that matters. Inside him, in the language he thinks in, and the stories he tells, and the knowledge of where the water is, and which roads are safe, and which families can be trusted when the journey gets difficult. All of it is there. None of it is lost. The crossroads of civilization is not a place on a map. It is a practice of engagement with the world as it actually is, refined across thousands of years by people who learned, at great cost, that the only things worth carrying across the desert are the things that cannot be taken from you. Every great empire of the ancient world eventually wanted this land. None of them ever resolved what to do with the people who had always lived on it. The merchant holds the answer in his memory. His son holds it in his, and their children after them. Speaking languages neither of them can imagine. Traveling by means neither of them can conceive. But following the same essential logic and maintaining the same essential conversation and passing the same essential knowledge forward through whatever darkness the next century brings. The light is fading now over the Syrian hills. The stars are coming out above the desert. The same stars that Babylonian astronomers mapped and Phoenician sailors navigated by and the shepherds of the Levantine highlands have been reading since before any of the empires we have named tonight existed. They are still there. They were always going to be there. Sleep well.